We appreciate her substituting today and being our music director today. We appreciate it. If you have your Bibles today, let's turn to 1 Samuel today. Make that 2 Samuel. A few verses that we'll read this morning. 2 Samuel, the 9th chapter. If you have your Bibles and would like to follow along, I'm going to read that entire chapter. Don't get too upset. It's just 13 verses, so we'll handle it this morning. 2 Samuel, the 9th chapter, beginning with the first verse. Then David said, "Is there yet anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "I am your servant." And the king said, "Is there not yet anyone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God?" And Ziba said to the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan who is crippled in both feet." So the king said to him, "Where is he?" And Ziba said to the king, "Behold, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel in Lodebar." Then King David went and brought him from the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel from Lodebar. Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and prostrated himself and David said, "Mephibosheth," and he said, "Here is your servant." David said to him, "Do not fear, for I will surely show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you will eat at my table regularly." Again he prostrated himself and said, "What is your servant that you should regard a dead dog like me?" Then the king called Saul's servant Ziba and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul and to his house, all his house, I give to your master's grandson. You and your sons and your servants shall cultivate the land for him, and you shall bring in the produce so that your master's grandson may have food. Nevertheless, Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall eat at my table regularly." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so your servant will do." So Mephibosheth ate at the king's table as one of the king's sons. Think about that. Isn't that wonderful? And Mephibosheth, probably called him Phoebe or something for short. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table as one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in the house of Ziba were servants to Mephibosheth. So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate at the king's table regularly. And as if the author wanted to remind you one more time at the end of this story, he says, "Now he was lame in both feet." Let's look at the story of Mephibosheth for a second here. Mephibosheth, first of all, we realize that he was of the house of Saul. Saul was a former king of Israel, of course, we know that. And usually when a king came to power, there would be a purge of all the former king's family. And usually the former king's family would be killed or they would be exiled. So Mephibosheth basically knew that he had a price on his head. The new ruler would come to power like David and have all of the heirs of the throne from the other families usually wiped out or sent in exile. And you have to remember now that Saul spent most of his reign trying to wipe David out. Saul spent most of his time trying to kill David because David was charismatic. David had been anointed king after Saul had fallen away. And so the Bible teaches us that the house of Saul was primarily an enemy to David. So here you have Mephibosheth. That's his story. He just happened to be born in a family, the grandson of the former king, and the former king was an enemy to the reigning king. Now let's look at the situation of Mephibosheth this morning. He was the grandson of Saul. He was the son of Jonathan. And the Bible teaches us there was some kind of situation when he had to leave the house very quickly in this very difficult time between David and between Saul. And the maid or the servant picked Mephibosheth up and dropped him and injured both of his feet. And from that day on, he was a cripple. So here you have a guy, Mephibosheth, who was in a desperate situation. Think about how desperate his situation is. He was crippled. He was forgotten. He was abandoned. And there was absolutely no reason for this boy to hope. Absolutely no reason for him to hope, because the king that was on the throne was an enemy to his house. And he lived in this place called Lodebar. And Lodebar in the Hebrew means no pasture. It was an out-of-the-way place. It was the end of the world, so to speak. It was desolate, and it was barren. So that's the situation of Mephibosheth. A man living out in the country, alienated from the house of the king at the time, crippled, no welfare, no kind of crippled children or anything like that to help him out. His situation was absolutely and totally hopeless. Now, here's David, who comes to the throne. And in our text this morning, we realize that David is on the throne. And as we read 2 Samuel here, we find out that he has now destroyed most of his enemies. And he is sitting on the throne in peace now. And now that he's on the throne, David begins to look around, and he asks this incredible question that we have in 2 Samuel 9 there. David asks, he says, "Is there anybody left in Saul's house that I can show kindness to them?" Now, in light of what I just told you, isn't that a marvelous statement by David? What a wonderful man. David would have had all right to say, "Is there anybody else left in the house of Saul that I could take their head off? Is there anybody left in the house of Saul that I can absolutely destroy them so that they would have no reigns on my kingdom?" He would have had every right to say that as an Oriental king. But David didn't say that. David looked around and he said, "Is there anybody left in the house of Saul that I can show kindness to?" Not a random act of kindness, but an act of kindness with a clear purpose and a clear motive. Now, why did David do this? Why did David do this? If you notice in the text today, it said that David did it for Jonathan's sake. David did this because of Jonathan, his very good friend, and the father of Mephibosheth. Jonathan had been so good to David. Jonathan had saved David's life, and now that Saul and Jonathan were all gone, David wanted to pass it on. David wanted to pay it forward. David wanted to repay the kindness that had come to him from Jonathan. Let's go in your Bibles. Open your Bibles again to 1 Samuel this time. 1 Samuel, go to 1 Samuel, the 20th chapter. Now, I won't take time to read the entire 20th chapter, of course. But in the 20th chapter of 1 Samuel, we have this covenant between David and Jonathan. 1 Samuel 20, verse 1. "Then David fled from Naioth to Ramah and came and said to Jonathan, 'What have I done? What is my iniquity? And what is my sin before your father, that he is seeking my life?' And he said to him," Jonathan says, "Far from it, you shall not die. Behold, my father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me. So why should my father hide anything from me? It's not so." So Jonathan was saying to David here, "Now look, I know everything my dad knows, and if he's trying to kill you, I'll find it out." In verse 17 of that chapter, look what it says. "Jonathan made David a vow again because of his love for him, because he loved him as he loved his own life. Jonathan loved David as he loved his own life. Look at verse 42 of that same chapter. Now, in this chapter, there was this scheme for Jonathan to help David out, and he shot arrows, and it was a signal for David to run, and you can read that in this chapter. I won't take time to read that. But look at verse 42 of that chapter. Jonathan said to David, "Go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever." Then he rose and departed, while Jonathan went into the city. And we know the rest of the story. Jonathan was killed a little bit later on. So here is David on his throne. Everything's going good for him, and he says, I want to show some kindness to Jonathan's house because he showed kindness to me. We have all experienced kindness, have we not? Every one of us in here have experienced extraordinary kindness in our life by somebody. Every one of us have. And it is our responsibility to be like David, to look for opportunities to pass that kindness on. How selfish of us today if we are shown kindness and we keep that kindness and we're not kind to other people. Isn't it wonderful today to know that people have been kind to you and you have the responsibility and the opportunity to pass that kindness on? While I am preaching this sermon this morning, I want you to think of somebody today that has been kind to you and how you can repay that person. And if they're dead and gone, how you can repay their descendants, how you can repay their children or their grandchildren. I want you to be thinking today of somebody like Mephibosheth that you can say, is there not somebody that I can show kindness to that has shown kindness to me? I want you to be thinking about that person today. It's wonderful to be able to pass on kindness, is it not? Isn't it a sad thing not to pass on kindness? Isn't it a sad thing to not pass on kindness? To be kind, someone be kind to you, and you not pass on kindness. Reminds me of the story I read this week of a guy who was bit by a dog. And they rushed him to the hospital, and this was before the rabies shot. And the doctor said, I got some bad news for you. You got rabies. You're going to die. Nothing we can do for you. Rabies is fatal. The man says, well, what in the world can I do? And the doctor says, there's nothing you can do. The best thing you can do is to sit down and write out your last will and testament and get your house in order. So they got the boys some paper and pencil, and the doctor left. And about an hour later, the doctor comes back, and the man is furiously writing away. And the doctor said, I am so glad you're writing out your last will. And the man said, this ain't no will. This is a list of 10 people that I'm going to bite. So it's wonderful to pass on kindness, isn't it? It's a sad thing not to pass on kindness. Wanting to bite somebody rather than passing on that kindness. When you pass on kindness, you are empathetic with other people. You empathize with them. You are able to walk in their shoes. You know what they have been going through. David knew what it was like to be a refugee. David knew what it was like to flee from Saul. David knew what it was like to go to bed at nighttime and not really know if he would be alive the next day. Mephibosheth went to bed at nighttime and did not know if the king that was sitting on the throne would spare his life. But David had empathy toward Mephibosheth. When we show kindness, we show empathy with other people. When we show kindness, we are encouraging to other people. It's a wonderful thing to encourage other people by kindness. People today need encouragement. You run into people every day that need to be encouraged. There is nothing worse than discouragement. Discouragement can bring a person down. Discouragement can bring a person down into a hole of depression. But one word of encouragement, one way to encourage somebody will lift those people a lot of times out of their darkness. Just one small act of encouragement. David was encouraging to Mephibosheth. How encouraging it must have been for Mephibosheth. After you say that word for a while, you begin to mess it up. So if I mess it up, don't worry about it. It must have been very encouraging for Mephibosheth to be sitting there at the table eating with the sons of David, with the king's son. Looking around, he saw all the sons of David eating at the king's table, and he himself, a cripple, a person that could not offer a thing to David, a person that was a member of the enemy household, here he was eating a meal with the king and his son. How encouraging that had to be for Mephibosheth. When you are kind to people, I thought about this, you give them a kind of endowment. You give them an endowment when you are kind to people. You give them determination. Maybe you encourage them or are kind to them, and you give them determination to go on. Maybe you give them fortitude. Maybe you give them an attitude in their heart that can help them go on when you are encouraging and when you are kind to them. When you are kind to people, it is something that they never, ever will forget. You never forget an act of kindness in your life. And when you treat those Mephibosheths in your life, they will never forget it. I know Herbert Hoover. A lot of bad rap for Herbert Hoover over the years. Of course, he was president during the Depression. But before Herbert Hoover became president, at the end of World War I, he was the head of the Allied Relief Agency in Europe, sort of like the Marshall Plan in World War II. Hoover was the head of this agency that fed and helped all of these displaced persons in World War I. Hoover helped to feed thousands and thousands and thousands of people in Europe. In Finland, they came up with a Finnish word, and the word still exists today. It's a word in the Finnish language, and it means to hoover. Whenever you say to hoover in the Finnish language, it means that you are going to be kind and you're going to help somebody. Finland never forgot the kindness of the United States. And they put a word in their vocabulary to remember that kindness. Who's been kind to you? Who's been kind to you over the past? Who's been kind to you? Who has shown you kindness? As I was thinking about this sermon a few weeks ago, I began to ask myself, who has been kind to me? And so many people have been kind to me. It'd be impossible for me to stand up here and tell all the people that have been kind to me. But I remember one particular, and his name was Dr. Barry Callen. He was my seminary professor, one of my seminary professors. And he was also the chairman of my doctoral committee when I did my doctoral work. Dr. Callen's a wonderful professor. And here I am as a young 23-year-old young guy going into seminary, having the slightest idea what I was involved in and what seminary was that like. But Dr. Callen took me and he took Barbara under his wings, and he sort of nurtured us and helped us along the way. He was a mentor to me, somebody that I really, really liked, and somebody that I could go to any time when I had questions in my seminary work. I got to thinking about Dr. Callen the other day as I was preparing this message, and I gave Dr. Callen a call. It was right before the Church of God convention. And I said, Dr. Callen, I just want you and Arlene. Arlene has since passed away with cancer, his wife. But I just said, Dr. Callen, I just want you to know I appreciate how kind you were to me and how you helped me so much along the way, encouraging and then helping me. There was silence on the other end of the phone. And Dr. Callen said, well, Lee, you always were my smartest student I ever had. You laugh? He really? No, I was kidding. No, Dr. Callen began to talk to me about our time together. But I thought to myself, he showed me kindness. And I wanted him to know before he died. He may outlive me, but I wanted him to know that I appreciate his kindness. Who's been kind to you? Who can you call today? Who can you send a card to today and say thank you? Who can you pay it forward to today? I ran across, as I was working in the state on the credentials committee, I ran across this young minister down in Chattanooga. And he was beginning his ministry and working to be ordained. And here not too long ago, I was looking at all my books, and I said to myself, I can't use all of these books. I'm 65 years old. I won't be able to use all these. These books can last a lifetime. What can I do with these books? And I had this 20-volume set of what's called the Biblical Illustrator, wonderful book. I have used them for 30-something years. There's enough material in those books for 1,000 preachers to use for 1,000 years. And I said, what am I going to do with these books? And I thought about that young pastor. And I called him up and I said, the next time you're in Knoxville, I've got a whole set of books for you. And the next time he was in Knoxville, we loaded those books up in his car and he took them on. You know how I got those books? I didn't pay a penny for those books. Those books were a gift to me from my secretary in Ohio. And they would be thrilled today to know that I used those books extensively and I was able to pass those books on to a young minister. There'll be other books that I'll pass on. I'll get most of my sermons from the internet then, but just kidding, of course. Just kidding. Like Norm, you got rid of all your books, have you, Norm? Or Jerry, I don't know if y'all still got your books or not. Pass some of your books along. You know, nowadays when somebody waits on you, they almost act like they're doing you a favor, don't they? I was at a restaurant last night. I needed some supper, so I'm batching it this week, so I went to a restaurant. And waitress acted like she was doing me a favor, even for me to find a table. Doesn't that just sort of stick in your craw when you're at a restaurant and they act like that you're a bother to them? You're paying their salary, but you're a bother to them. Not too long ago, I was at a restaurant here in town, and the waitress was exceptionally nice to me. She was refreshing compared to a lot of the other waitresses that you have and see sometimes. I know waitresses, I know people have hard times sometimes, and sometimes they take it out on you, but I was so impressed by this lady, an older lady. She was so, made sure that my food was hot, make sure that everything was okay, came back 2 or 3 times, can I refill your tea, can I do this and that for you? And I was so impressed by her. I left that restaurant, I went to my office, and I found the website of that restaurant. And I wrote the headquarters a letter using that lady's name and saying, this was one of the best waitresses I've ever had in my life. And I just want you to know I commend her, and she probably needs a raise. I never heard from anybody, of course, but I wanted to pass it on. The lady was kind to me. And when people are kind to you, make sure you pass it on. There was a complete stranger. I was reading these stories. There was a complete stranger that paid $10,000 to a lady who did not have the money so that lady could have a liver operation. Otherwise, she would die. She had no idea who paid the $10,000 for her surgery. One lady contacted a hospital to see if there were any needy families. She had these frequent flyer miles added up, and she said, I want to use these miles, and is there anybody anywhere that can use these miles? And they found a family who lived in Australia, a sick member in the hospital, and they brought that family from Australia to be in that hospital. A handicapped lady had a 10-minute neck and shoulder massage, and she left money for the next person to have a massage. A young boy saw that a policeman was about ready to give a ticket at a parking meter for a man, and the young boy went over and put in more coins in the parking meter so that the fellow would not have a parking ticket. Small acts of kindness. Pass them on, because people have been kind to you. There was a boy by the name of Miles Eckert, and he was coming into Cracker Barrel. And when he came into Cracker Barrel, he found a $20 bill laying there. Now, I would have probably thought, aha, I'm going to get Uncle Herschel's breakfast with this. But as the boy was going into Cracker Barrel, there was a soldier coming out, an officer in the Air Force, and he gave that $20 to that officer, and he said, I want you to have this $20 because, you see, my dad was a soldier, and he was killed in Afghanistan. And I want you to have this $20 in honor of my father. And that story went all over the internet of that boy's kindness, of how he paid it forward. There's another interesting story. A woman drove up to Starbucks. I think Larry was in a line in front of her. A woman pulled up to the Starbucks at 7 o'clock in the morning at a St. Petersburg store in Florida. And she got this caramel, and I asked Linda how you pronounce this. I'm not exactly for sure how you pronounce this, macchiato, or whatever, coffee. Close enough, isn't it? And she bought hers, and she paid for the person behind her. She says, I don't know what the person behind me is going to get, but I buy them this particular coffee. And they did. And that person paid for the next person coming up behind the line. And that person paid for the next person. And by 1:30 that afternoon, 260 people had paid for the coffees of the people behind them. All because that one lady did one act of kindness. And 260 people had their coffee paid for and paid for the one behind them. President Obama said something the other day that I thought was very encouraging. He was at the funeral of that pastor that was shot in South Carolina, and he said that even though there is evil in our country, he said, in this country, there is a reservoir of goodness. Think about it. There is a reservoir of goodness in our country. And I believe that reservoir of goodness in our country shows that people are kind. And that if we are kind, it's our responsibility to pay it forward, to pass it on. John Wesley told a group of Christians, he said, do all the good you can, by all the means you can, in all the ways that you can, in all places that you can, and at all times when you can, to all people that you can, as long as you ever can. That's kindness, isn't it? Who have you thought of in this sermon that's been kind to you, that you can show kindness to? I'll close with one story. Anthony Campolo, I heard Anthony Campolo a lot, and I actually heard him when he told this story at Praise Gathering in Indianapolis. And I'll close with this story. Anthony Campolo, he was a wonderful minister and writer, professor. A few decades ago, he was very, very popular. Tony Campolo tells an unforgettable story. A lady named Miss Thompson, who had forgotten that lesson about kindness, even though she was a Christian. Miss Thompson taught the 5th grade, and at the beginning of the year, she made it a point to tell the class that she had no favorites and that she would try to treat each child equally. Yet she failed in that purpose. Teddy Stollard was his name. Teddy Stollard was not the kind of child that you just warmed up to, and neither did Miss Thompson. Teddy's clothes were musty, and his hair was unkempt. He had little facial expression. His eyes always seemed glassy and unfocused. Teddy was hardly a personable child, not particularly likable, not very popular to the others. Mrs. Thompson found herself hardened toward Teddy, almost getting a certain perverse pleasure out of marking big X's on his paper. She ought to have known better, the story says, because she looked at the records of little Teddy. And here's what it said. 1st grade, Teddy shows promise with his work and attitude, but he has a poor home situation. 2nd grade, The note said, Teddy could do better. Mother is seriously ill. He receives little help at home. 3rd grade. Teddy's a good boy, but too serious. He's a slow learner. His mother died this year.